Greetings to everyone online from Singapore, and we're being somewhat innovative because I'm happy to say that part of our in-person audience includes the participants in the first in-person CIL Singapore Academy for International Law. So welcome to all of you as well. I'm delighted to open this important panel and also welcome some very dear friends. First of all, of course, Danielle, who's lead of our climate change program here at CIL. And I know dear Diane Tan from the AGC and my dear friend Petra Minarov from Durham University, and of course the other panelists as well. I just want to let the panelists know, the participants here just had a crash course on climate change. We went from UNFCCC, Kyoto to Paris, COP28. And so I hope I've set the scene for COP29. And I think we all look forward to your insights as to what happened at COP29 and what's going to happen afterwards. So greetings to everyone, and I turn over to you, Danielle.
Here we go. Thank you very much. Let's just make sure that we have Nina on the screen as well. We have all the panelists highlighted on the screen. And so thank you very much, Nilofer, for the opening remarks, and to Rayla Rayla for getting us started today. So I want to start the context for today's discussion. To recall, COP29 concluded with a new finance goal of at least $300 billion per year by 2035 for developing country parties. Substantial decisions were also made under Article 6.2 and 6.4 agenda items, which effectively operationalize the marketplace-based cooperative approaches of the Paris Agreement. And among other achievements, COP29 also extended the Lima Work Programme on gender, provided further guidance on indicators of the global goal on adaptation, which will be a big issue in this year's COP. On the mitigation front, by COP29, we had 3 countries that submitted their nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, ahead of the 10th February 25th deadline, which demonstrated ambitious 1.5 degrees goal aligned targets, while coalition of both developed and developing countries pledged to submit NDCs, which feature top-line economy-wide targets leading to net zero targets. However, no agreement was reached on how to bring the 2024 global stocktake outcomes relating to the transition away from fossil fuels. Now, of course, as widely expected, COP29 was in November. We are now in January, and then in January 25, the new U.S. administration announced the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. Now, numerous countries have reiterated their continued support and commitment to the Paris Agreement, but at the same time, we have higher-level officials from Argentina and Indonesia expressing doubts subsequent to the U.S. withdrawal. And major U.S. banks have also since announced their exit from the important net zero banking alliance. So now where are we now? We are now in March 25. The hopes and aspirations that accompanied the end of COP29 almost seems like a distant past. Quoting Singapore's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Vivian Balakrishnan, just 3 days ago in his parliamentary speech, a new world order is taking shape, characterized by profound unpredictability, instability, and volatility. And our ability to respond collectively to global threats and to safeguard the global commons has been significantly impaired. The collective commitment to international institutions, as well as compliance with international treaties like the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement that resulted from it, are all waning. So what is the impact of this volatile and uncertain landscape on the ambition of the updated NDC contributions that parties are due to submit in February 25? What potential national policy changes are in store? And from a corporate enterprise perspective, what remains the compelling outcomes from COP29 vis-a-vis the impact of the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement? In short, what lies ahead for the future of global climate action leading up to COP30 this year? To answer these and more questions, I'm delighted to introduce our 4 experts who will be speaking today. First, we have Ms. Diane Tan, Deputy Director General of the International Affairs Division, Attorney General's Chambers of Singapore. She's also a member of the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee. We then have Professor Petra Minerup, Director of the Center for Sustainable Development Law and Policy, who's also the Executive Dean Global of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Health, who joins us from a very early morning in Durham University as a Professor of International Law. And Mr. Puan Si Liang, our third speaker, is the Assistant Vice President of Strategy and Development Group at Gen Zero. Gen Zero is founded by the Temasek Group, that's a global investor focused on impact investing to accelerate decarbonization globally. Last but not least, delighted to welcome Cecilia Treaser-Garwick-Nena, Operations Director and co-founder of Barabukos. It's an interesting consultancy that works on legal and policy issues within the broader ESG context. And she's also the head legal officer at the University of Philippines Institute of International Legal Studies. So we'll begin soon, but can I also invite participants to use the chat function or the Q&A function to indicate your questions as we go along. So first, Diane, can I turn to you? Now, COP29, of course, sits not in isolation, but in a continuation from a basis of commitments which parties entered into on a consensus basis. So from your perspective, government legal advisor and negotiator, what would you flag as the outcomes from COP29 that has the most significant impact? And of course, further to that, the question that all of us have, what are your thoughts on the future of global climate action in the light of the recent developments that I've just highlighted? Over to you, Diane. 10 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you to CIL for being part of this panel. It is my honor to be here to speak to you. I start off with my usual caveat that I am speaking in my personal capacity. Before I go any further, I thought to set the context a little bit for my comments, which is that I come from the negotiator track. So whilst you might criticize a lot of the outcomes of COP, just remember there are negotiators working hard tirelessly to get outcomes at the end of the day. So just bear that in mind. I have been in the COP process for quite a while. I started back in the time actually when it was post-Copenhagen. So it was a bit, not so positive. I started in 2010. And as with all things, and in any process, I think there are ups and downs. That's my belief. You're going to get a good COP, you're going to get a bad COP. And since I've rejoined the circuit after my hiatus in 2021 in Glasgow, I must say we have been on a fairly positive upswing where, from Glasgow to Sharm el-Sheikh to UAE for the global stocktake, I would like to think that we have had successful COPs. Truth be told, I was not optimistic where we would be in Baku, which was dubbed the Finance COP. As we all know, finance is a fairly tricky and complex issue. And, Danielle spoke about, in January, the new administration coming in. But by the time, and it was a bit surreal, it was 2 weeks, I think, or a week before we got to Baku, we already knew the results of the US elections and things were not looking optimistic. But I was proven wrong. We did land on a Baku Climate Unity Pact. It was no doubt under very challenging circumstances, and we really ran right down to the wire. But multilateralism did deliver something. Not the most ideal of things, but at least something. A move in the right direction for enhancing implementation and support for global climate action in this critical decade. Now, as a negotiator, I must say that it's not just spin when we dub COP29 as a finance COP. If on the ground, delegations were organized with a singular goal of really trying to deliver on the new collective quantified goal, NCQG for short. And so really that's the key outcome that I will focus on, because that's where actually most of my attention was at COP29. But before I get to that outcome, I should just very quickly start by saying that the finalization of the rules for carbon markets under Article 6 I trust my colleague and former dear negotiator on the Singapore delegation, Si Liang, will speak more about it. I just want to flag that Singapore played a small part in getting to that finalization. Our Minister for Environment and Sustainability, Minister Grace Fu, helmed the ministerial coordination together with New Zealand. And it is our hope, of course, that the finalization of the rules will facilitate the use of Article 6 as a key mechanism to raise ambition under the Paris Agreement. I turn now to NCQG. It pretty much, in my view, encapsulated what COP29 was all about. I won't go into the details. I think Danielle has already spoken about, the at least 30 billion per year by 2035 as the target. And then, of course, the aspirational 1.3 trillion, which had led one delegate at the end of the conference to say that the COP decision was all about an optical illusion. When I was preparing for this panel, I did think about the question, was this the best outcome we could have wished for? I think the answer must surely be no. But relative to not having any outcome at all, I would argue that having achieved what we did in Baku was really better than not having any outcome. And not having any outcome in a COP process is something that actually is very, very possible because it's a multilateral process, having 200 states come together to land. And for those who are familiar with the COP process, we go by the rule of consensus. So it's not always easy to come and land together collectively, but we did in Baku. I think some questions have been posed whether or not they would have been useful to sort of kick the can down the road. And I just want to remind colleagues that the mandate to secure the NCQG, we couldn't achieve it in Paris. So in the Paris COP29, it was decided that the NCQG would be revised from there'll be a new one from the floor of a US 100 billion per year by 2024. So it wasn't, I mean, this has been 9 years in the making. And so just kicking it further down the road, I don't think would have been wise. And I think also one thing we do want to bear in mind is that at least we have at least 300 billion on the table per year by 2035, coincides nicely with the next round of 2035 NDCs that were supposed to be submitted by 10th of February this year. And I think the delivery of this climate finance, at least putting a number on the table, will help to signal and support not just the preparation, but really the implementation of ambitious NDCs, and as well as help developing countries in dealing with devastating climate impacts. I think a large part of the discussions, we always talk about the figure, is it aspirational, is it not, which part of it is the target. But I think there are two key procedural aspects to the COP decision that we arrived at COP29 that doesn't, I think, get as much airtime, and I think it should. The first is that it's a given, 1.3 trillion. It's such a big number, but it has been placed on the table. It is aspirational. And in COP29, we did launch a roadmap. The roadmap is a Baku to Belém roadmap to 1.3T. We will start seeing it come together at COP30. And I think it's a shift in the right direction. The other procedural aspect to the COP29 decision at NCQG, which doesn't get picked up so much, but I think it's useful to also flag, is that we have now brought the finance component into the global stocktake. That has always been one of those things where sort of the finance kind of didn't fit in quite well to our once every 5-year GST, which is the key architecture sort of review mechanism put in place for Paris Agreement. So now that's all come together under the house of GST. And so I think that's actually, not to be OCD about it, but I think that's really useful for our GST to now also bring in discussions on finance formally, and it will then take it forward in the every 5-year cycle. So the next GST will be 2028, I believe. And finally, I think the third peg procedurally that people also should take note of is that this decision of the NCQG of COP29 is going to be reviewed. And it will be reviewed in 2030. So in 5 years' time, we will be back at the table to relook the goal and restart negotiations to see where things go. So all things, figures aside, I do think procedurally, there have been pegs put in place in order for the discussions on NCQG, on the finance goal, and what climate finance is needed by developing countries to continue in the negotiation process. And I think to a large extent, there has to be an acceptance that with any multilateral process, things have to take place iteratively. If you have a peg, utilize it, leverage on it, and try to move the discussions forward. And hopefully, with some optimism, perhaps geopolitical landscape might improve down the road. To Danielle's question about how to be optimistic in the current climate that we're in, I think it would be an understatement to say that we are obviously worried. But again, we knew of the withdrawal, and then it then happened in January. Singapore, on our part, we are a firm supporter of the multilateral process. We are a firm supporter of the Paris Agreement and UNFCCC. We have submitted our NDC on time. We've submitted our biannual transparency report on time, and we hope countries will do the same. And with Danielle's indulgence, I'm just going to segue a little bit, and I'm happy to take more questions on my role on the Paris Agreement Compliance and Implementation Committee. But I think it's important to flag that whilst we are obviously very concerned about the geopolitical challenges ahead of us, the truth is that work is ongoing. Technical work continues as we are in the implementation phase of the Paris Agreement. And so the role that I play on the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee is going to be, I believe, a very critical piece of the implementation puzzle for Paris Agreement. And so just give some background to what we like to call ourselves PIKE. So what PIKE is about, we were set up under Article 15 of the Paris Agreement. It's a mechanism to facilitate implementation and promote compliance with provisions of the Paris Agreement. We are expert-based committee, facilitative in nature, meaning to say we function in a manner that's non-adversarial. We are transparent, we are not punitive. And we will pay particular attention to the respective national capabilities and circumstances of parties. I will be happy to speak more later on, because I'm not sure, I've lost track of my timing, but we're happy to speak more.
Yes, if you could wrap up, Diane, and then we'll go come back to you for that. Perfect.
I will. So so just very quickly, it's tough times ahead, but we must press on, and I'll be happy to share more about how we will press on as PIKE. Thank you.
Perfect, Diane. Thanks very much for that great negotiator overview of the background, and it's always great to end on an optimistic and hopeful note. On that, maybe I can then move to Petra. And then Diane mentioned about the global stocktake, COP29 for the first anniversary of that. And of course, there's been a lot of criticisms on how COP29 didn't take forward the outcomes. But in your view, did COP28 how did it advance the GSE outcomes or indeed the goals of the Paris Agreement? And in particular, we heard about the NDCs, but to date, actually, over only 15, I think, state parties have actually submitted new NDCs. Over 90% actually have failed to do so by the timeline. Could you address some of these questions? Thank you, Petra.
Yes, thank you very much, Danielle. Thank you, Raya. Thank you, Niloufar. Wonderful to be here, at least online with you this morning or afternoon for you. I'd much rather be in the room with you, of course, but maybe there's an opportunity on the horizon. Thank you also so much, Diane, for your introduction. I think there's nothing better than hearing from those who have actually been involved in the negotiations, so I could listen to you for hours still. Very useful, and I completely agree. We are very much in the hands of the negotiators, but also very much in the hands of the COP presidencies, who, in my mind, have a really huge influence on how everything develops, how the draft negotiation texts are being put together, how parties feel enough informed, and so on. I will just share, before I share, hopefully, my screen with you and a few slides only with you, also that I think there is a real risk that these areas become more detached from one another at each COP. We already see negotiators very much in one room, literally speaking, and academia and science experts in the other room. So I think it's sometimes very useful to remind ourselves that there is a real scientific urgency. And just today, again, in the headline, it was that the global ice sheet cover is at a record low due to the heat wave in February again. So we are talking here in the sense of urgency, I think. So I would like to start sharing my screen. Am I sharing my screen? Can you see that?
Yes, perfect. We can see. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. That's wonderful. So I would like to speak about these 3 points: the global stocktake and NDCs 3.0, as they're called. And I'm very excited. Singapore has already submitted one. So have a few other countries. I'm teaching on the Singaporean NDC this afternoon, actually. I will then have a few comments on the legal nature of NDCs, which is maybe an argument that it can be contested. Of course, there can be different views, but as an academic scholar, maybe that is my right to introduce you to some of the thinking. And I've thought very deeply actually about the legal nature of NDCs. And then what is the role of COPs going forward? Because I know, Danielle, you asked this question also, what is the meaning and what is the role of the international COPs, of this framework, of this multilateralist approach that we have, and what is the future of it in the light of the recent political changes that we have seen? So just to recall perhaps something that's already agreed in the Paris Agreement, is that parties, for the first time now after the first global stocktake concluded in 2023, must submit new NDCs, and they must demonstrate in their NDCs that the planning process has been informed by the outcome of the global stocktake. And when you see, even though countries have maybe not said too much in these sections, they have by and large all address this section where they have to demonstrate that their preparation of the climate policies that they set forth in the NDCs have been informed by the outcome of the global stocktake. Now, of course, there is a wider way of analyzing the NDC. So it's not just taking this one section where states talk about themselves into account, but we can also see that more widely throughout the NDC, that some have taken this very seriously. So, and just to recall, if you have this kind of analytical framework that is defined by the global stocktake outcome, what are the key elements that maybe we have missed to some extent in the COP29 decision, but they are very much there in the global stocktake outcome and should be taken forward regardless of what COP29 had as an outcome. So I would just like to highlight a few, and I know this is an audience that is very well versed in these issues, but there is an obligation that parties have entered into to triple renewable energy capacity, to phase down unabated coal power, to accelerate efforts towards net zero emission energy systems, transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner, accelerating action in this critical decade so as to achieve net zero by 2050. So we shouldn't forget that this is still the benchmark. This is what we have agreed to do, and also the just and orderly transition. I know there was no agreement to even discuss further the Just Transition Work Program, but there is a mandate here that we can generate from this decision to do so, and to do so to our really best efforts at the next COP. So just in short, this means parties must come forward in their NDCs 3.0 with ambitious economy-wide emission reduction targets covering all greenhouse gases, sectors and categories, and that these targets are aligned with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, as informed by the latest science. So science is very much there, and the law and the policies have to follow. So regardless of what we think about the ambitious cover decision that came out of COP29 and some other areas that were maybe not as successful as the new goal on finance, I think this is still something that will continue, because this is the outcome of the global stocktake and it prevails. So when we now think, if I come to the second part, and only very briefly, I'm not going to speak about the full argument. I've outlined it in an article and I included the reference as I was allowed to do, I think. So when we think about the legal nature, there's been much discussion, especially in the earlier literature, when the Paris Agreement had just been concluded, that NDCs are just a political contribution. There are no commitment, and this is why the wording was chosen. That was one view, but even at that time, there was another view, and that was supported by some countries to say that NDCs will be legally binding as an instrument. That is very different from saying there is a predetermined target in each NDC, like the Kyoto Protocol did for some countries. But it is still possible to make the argument that NDCs are unilateral acts. And I introduce in this article a new category where I say they are prescribed, qualified unilateral acts. So prescribed means they are prescribed in the treaty. It's not a free decision for a state to submit an NDC. It's a legal obligation, and that is, I think, widely agreed. There's a procedural obligation. You can frame it as such, but it is an obligation. You shall do so. And then they are qualified, and that is a process that is the global stocktake. The global stocktake has the objective to subsequently qualify and limit the discretion of parties in exercising their nationally determined contributions. So they can, in light of the outcome of the global stocktake, not have the same discretion. They must align with the outcomes of the global stocktake they've agreed to as well. So these are then prescribed qualified unilateral acts, and there are some other obligations, due diligence obligations, accounting, and the ICTU information. So all these information requirements placed upon states, of course, also support this argument that the leeway to exercise discretion absolutely freely is limited through the rules that were agreed in Glasgow, but also through the global stocktake outcome. Now, of course, for an international lawyer, the first question is, when you talk about a unilateral act, where's the intention to be bound? So the intention to be bound occurs at the first time when the Paris Agreement is concluded, because every state has agreed to submit these NDCs and has agreed that there will be a multilateral authority exercised over nationally contributions. So there was already at that time clarity that these individual measures would be necessary to make the Paris Agreement work, quite frankly. So these NDCs are pillars, key pillars of the Paris Agreement. Of course, we then have to scrutinize at the point of submission of an NDC, is this intention to be bound still present? And unless the state has completely rescinded and stepped back from this intention to be bound, there is the assumption that this will still be present. And most parties actually expressly say that they submit their NDCs to fulfill an obligation under the Paris Agreement, to set their international climate targets and so on. So this intention to be bound by what they put forward is still very much there across the board. What we, of course, don't have is a coherency in terms of the substance and the scope and the reach of these targets, but that is something that is independent from saying, as an instrument, NDCs are legally binding. That relates to the substance and the scope of the obligations created. And that is something that is perfectly possible. We see that in treaties as well. Some treaties are very concrete. Some treaties are very generic, like the Paris Agreement itself, but it's still a binding treaty. So an NDC can be legally binding, even if the substance still is not as much there, is not as much concrete as we perhaps would hope for. But then there is the process to qualify this. And there will be, as you said, Diane, as well, there will be another global stocktake. And there's also the yearly process that follows up on this mechanism. So what is then, and this is the last slide, what is then in this context, coming back to the role of COPs, and COPs have a clear mandate. And I think that was a bit lost again at COP29. There's a clear mandate that flows from Article 7 of the UNFCCC to review the implementation and the efforts of states in light of the science. So we need to, again, bring these two together. We are not freely deciding in terms of economic prospects and prosperity and other objectives that states very justifiably, of course, have, but it's also in light of the scientific evidence. So that is now the next step for COP30 to review these NDCs. And I think what we are lacking at the moment in COPs is a mechanism to adjust NDCs afterwards. We have the synthesis report prepared by the Secretariat, we have the review mechanism, but what we really need is to have a mechanism by which maybe academia and scientists can work with the negotiators to find a mechanism through which we can then support countries in adjusting their NDCs after the COPs, and really having this updating process more ingrained in the whole system. And again, the GST outcome is very clear. There's a clear emphasis on multilateralism, so we cannot step away from that. And there's also an acknowledgement in the GST outcome decision that the IPCC, in fact, states that international cooperation is a critical enabler. So whatever happens at COP must happen in the light of the science and the GST outcome. And it should also define how we deal with the NDCs in the aftermath of COP. So with that, I come to my final slide and say thank you again very much for having me. Great pleasure, as always. Wonderful to be here with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petra, for sharing the elements, your thoughts on this process, and also for very, very interesting, very important proposals and suggestions as to how one should view the NDCs. And I think that will certainly stimulate a lot of discussion in the months to come as a result of your article. And certainly a lot of thought has to be given to what really is the status of NDCs. And when countries make this make the NDCs commitment, it is a bottom-up, but what goes on after that and how is that layered upon by the GST's process? And interesting questions you've raised. And I'd love to hear the audience thought on that later. Can I turn to you now, Celia? We've heard a lot. Diane spoke about the outcomes in terms of finance. We've heard the 1.3 trillion goal, which is actually a call for all actors to come together to enable the scaling up of financing from all public and private sources. So let's turn to you for your thoughts on how COP29 has affected corporate enterprise decisions in that regard. Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle. And I think first to say thanks very much, CIL, for having me. Maybe I'll set some context on why I think the COP outcomes, while they were not the best, are not that bad. So maybe we'll start with NCQG, which Diane talked quite a bit about, right? The target was 1.3 trillion. And what we got was 300 billion. But I think to put things in context, maybe I'll make 2 points. So the first is that the previous target was 100 billion annually by 2020. And it was actually not an easy target for developed countries to hit. And it only took until 2022 that they were able to hit the target. I think another point that I would then raise is we are also in the context where fiscal space is tightening very seriously for a lot of countries, right? So in Europe, for example, even before Trump came into power, there was a big push for them to spend more on defense. And that was because of Russia and Ukraine. independent of demands that Trump is now making to increase defense spending. Globally, we had just gone through a pandemic, and there was a lot of government debt to stimulate economies and to deal with the effects of the pandemic. And so fiscal space was tight, and it was always going to be quite challenging for developed countries to agree to a substantially much larger target of 1.3 trillion. And of course, this was, as Diane mentioned, with the knowledge that the US was very likely to exit the Paris Agreement, because when COP started, everybody already knew that Trump was coming in, and it was widely speculation is not even the right word, right? Because I think it was an expectation. So I think on that front, excuse me, I think NC2G was maybe not as bad as it was painted out to be. The Article 6 outcomes were generally positive. One big reason for that was because, well, one, we had an outcome, and it was the closure of the Article 6 rulebook. And we are not expecting any negotiations, any new rules coming out of Article 6 until 2028. So that gives you about 4 years worth of certainty. Article 6 has always been a little bit contentious. So we first got agreement in Glasgow. We got some further agreement on the rules at Sham. But in Dubai, the negotiators weren't able to come to an agreement. So actually getting an agreement at Azerbaijan last year is not that trivial. There were a couple of things in the Article 6 rulebook that was also quite reassuring for us as investors. So one of the things that a lot of people were watching going to COP was whether corresponding adjustments can be revoked. So corresponding adjustments, I think maybe just to set some context, is where if one country transfers carbon credit to another country to use towards its NDC, it needs to add that back to its inventory, so there is no double counting. In other words, both countries cannot use the same emission reduction or removal. Now, the question was, going into this COP was, if a host country decides to issue a corresponding adjustment and that's being used by a buyer country, let's say, could the host country change its mind later? And COP's landing was to actually substantially narrow the space for revocation, which is to say you cannot revoke unless there are pre-specified conditions, which I think in my opinion is a sensible decision, because there could be legitimate scenarios where you want to change your mind, but that needs to be spelled out. So as investors, that gives us quite a bit of certainty. Another thing that was also quite good to see was that the Article 6.4 rulebook was settled. So the Article 6.4 mechanism is basically a mechanism that is going to come under the UNFCCC. It will have its own methodologies, which are basically procedures on how you develop carbon credit projects and issue carbon credits. And for a long time, I think there was no agreement on that. And to have that actually means that the Article 6.4 supervisory body can begin implementing a lot of the work that was agreed upon. So up to all the COPs, a lot of the discussion is really just talk, right? How we should design this mechanism and so on. I think now that we have agreement, and this year the 6.4 supervisory had its first meeting, I think last month in Bhutan, they've started to think about some of the mechanisms of operationalization. So things like setting up an interim registry, how some of the CDM, which is the old mechanism, how the projects there can be transitioned into the new mechanism, rules around how you demonstrate additionality, which is a requirement for carbon credits, approving independent auditors. These are the foundational requirements you need to put in place for the 6.4 mechanism to become operational. And we finally have the rules to be able to do that. So I think put together, it gives us confidence that the Article 6 outcomes, they give us confidence that carbon markets will continue to play a role in driving finance towards international mitigation. It also then allows, mitigation globally to be delivered where it makes the most cost efficient sense, right? It's also very crucial because CORSIA, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization scheme to cap emissions, also depends on Article 6 credits. So by doing this, actually quite a number of unlocks were achieved. Then I think I'll make a quick intervention around the impact on investments. I think while we see globally there is a little bit of a retreat from climate, independent and partly with COPs, I think we continue to believe that there is a need for global climate action, and we've made investments in that direction. It is quite clear that the world is not on track to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And failing to do so means we will have to combat climate change and have to have a lot of negative impacts on health, on the environment, on biological species. And ultimately, I think where I'm trying to get at is that the science cannot be denied. So I think it was John Holden, President Obama's science advisor, I believe, who said we basically have three choices, right? Mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. We're going to have to do some of each. And the question is what the mix is going to be. So as we see more suffering, and we've seen quite a lot of examples of that, there will be a stronger impetus for mitigation as well as adaptation. The other lens that I'll add on to this is COP signals, and I think very broadly, we are starting to see that the world is coming to see the green economy as an economic imperative. And increasingly, this economic imperative will color the lens of a lot of climate action. So we see that a lot of the pullback from climate is partly because of economic concerns. But there are areas where it makes economic sense and it makes climate sense. And these are maybe like green economy opportunities where we will see climate action continue to move forward. We see some countries like China and Singapore that are perhaps thinking about climate in this way and are still moving forward with it. And as a result, I think in certain sectors, maybe not necessarily across the board, for example, in renewables and EV, I think we continue to see, expect to see strong momentum and growth in their respects. So I guess the message I'm trying to get across is it's not all doom and gloom. It's definitely not pretty. But I think if you look hard enough, there are pockets for optimism.
That's great, Celia. Thank you very much for sharing that perspective. I think it's important for us listening to you to be able to collectively identify where those pockets are and continue in that positive light. Definitely, there are undeniable pullbacks in other areas on the parts of governments, on the parts of corporates as well. But where is the overall momentum? Are we still continuing to move in the same direction, albeit at a slightly different pace and perhaps in slightly different pathways, if I put it that way? So thanks very much for sharing that very important corporate perspective. Last but not least, Naina, may I turn to you now to share your perspective? I mean, you wear multiple hats, as I mentioned. In your past life, you've been a negotiator, the law on, and also working with multiple stakeholders, really, on issues ranging from agriculture, loss and damage, finance, sector-based integration, projects such as gender and climate. So could you share your perspective and particularly insights from working with the Global South and civil society? What are the key achievements and disappointments from the Baku Climate Unity Pact? Thank you. 10
Thanks,
minutes as well.
Let me just share my screen. First of all, I'd just like to thank CIL for having me. It's been a great session. I've been listening to everybody and I'm getting so many different perspectives that also add to what I've gathered so far. So my presentation is actually going to be kind of a reflection of what I've been hearing post COP29 from different sectors. So a lot of it from civil society, some insights from other government representatives, the academe, and I thought I'd just share it with everyone just to give everyone else just a little bit more perspective on how it is perceived, at least on the outside, Diane, it was great hearing about her perspectives coming as a negotiator who was very active in the NCQG negotiations. So this is just like another look at the outcomes of COP29 that may be a bit different. Right, so let me just, okay, so the NCQG. Based on what I've been hearing, there have been questions on whether it would be it's an acceptable outcome or it's maybe a major disappointment. So India, for example, has dismissed the amount of 300 billion as a paltry sum. And Nigeria has labeled it an insult, actually. And these are due to a number of things. So first, there is insufficient funding, they feel. So the 300 billion by 2035 commitment triples indeed the previous goal, but it does fall short of the 1.3 trillion per year that has been estimated by developing countries as what they would need for climate action, coming from international and public and private finance. We do recognize, of course, that $1.3 trillion is a massive amount, and the 100 billion that we were working towards even before was actually difficult to reach as it is. But I think part of this, and I'll go into this a bit more later on, is also a matter of transparency for a lot of stakeholders. There's also, they feel the lack of critical provisions. So there was a failure to include targets for adaptation finance, for example, concrete provisions for loss and damage finance. They feel developing countries feel that there was insufficient commitment to public grant-based finance, which leaves a lot of vulnerable nations at risk of falling deeper into debt distress. There's also the request of the Global South. So there seems to be for some, it was highlighted further, the difference between the Global North and the Global South, with the developing countries requesting, as mentioned earlier, greater emphasis on grants and low-interest loans, while developed countries' preference were more for funding contingent on private investment and mechanisms like fossil fuel levies, for example. So this has been met with some criticism from vulnerable nations, including small island developing states and least developed countries, who argue that it favors large emerging economies and maintains developed countries' business as usual approach while neglecting urgent needs of developing countries. So there is also the concern that relying on private finance could actually worsen debt burdens. Next is the stalled progress on critical issues that were identified. There was a lot of interest in how the transition away from fossil fuels that was included in the COP28 decision would be brought forward, but the final texts from COP29 failed to mention this. So a lot of people have seen it as a significant step backward from the progress that was made in relation to fossil fuels. There's also the negotiations on the mitigation work program and the just transition work program, which stalled and were postponed until later meetings. Let me just, okay, there. There has, of course, been some progress noted at COP29. There's the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund with disbursements that are set to begin in 2025. There are current pledges of up to 700 million, although some have still criticized this as being short of the estimated needs, which are estimated at around 300 billion annually by 2030. There's, as mentioned earlier, the Article 6 progress, after almost 10 years of negotiations. There are finally rules for carbon credits under the Paris Agreement. There are some concerns over safeguards, maybe credit integrity and potential marginalization of indigenous peoples and local communities. But in general, people are happy that there are finally rules on carbon credits. Then there's also the progress that was made in defining indicators for the UAE framework for global climate resilience, and health was actually also highlighted as a key area for strengthening adaptation and resilience. There are other positive developments as well. There were some early NDC submissions that happened during COP29. There was the commitment or the announcement from the world's top multilateral development banks on plans to provide 170 billion for climate finance annually by 2030. And there were global partnerships that were established during COP29. There were multiple bilateral agreements relating to Article 6.2 and the announcement of major initiatives to fund and expand Article 6 initiatives for, excuse me, international cooperation. So really, a lot of things picked up pace at COP29, especially in relation to carbon credits. There were, however, and I think this, I can tie this back to the NCQG negotiations process, concerns in relation to transparency and inclusion. I heard a lot about this. I've been hearing a lot about it actually in not just at the previous COP, but in COPs leading up to it. They feel that there is, there could be a lot of improvement in terms of transparency and inclusion in the negotiation process, for example. The NCQG in particular, some have noted was particularly opaque in terms of decision making. And this is something I've heard not just from civil society participants, but some countries as well, some states that are party to the negotiations. They feel that although they were provided, for example, draft texts that they could review, there was little consultation that took place when it comes to certain countries. So I think it also is a matter of which countries have been most included in the conversations for those that are actually parties to the negotiations, and for civil society, it's really transparency in general. They had no idea what was going on and had no access, and very few had access to the texts, the draft texts as they would come out. So they feel that the COP presidency just unexpectedly announced the text without allowing objections or discussions from some key developing nations. Diane mentioned this earlier about India as well. There's also the fossil fuel industry influence that a lot of stakeholders feel have been growing in past years, past COPs. So there was this concern, for example, where the COP29's chief executive and the Deputy Energy Minister of Azerbaijan was allegedly filmed agreeing to facilitate fossil fuel deals in exchange for sponsorship. So this kind of triggered concerns that COP29 was being used to advance fossil fuel interests rather than meaningful climate action. So I do agree that a lot of work goes into the COPs and then negotiating the decisions. Diane mentioned it earlier. I've had the opportunity to see how much work really goes into adopting these decisions. At the same time, I think there's also the transparency and inclusion concerns that we need to address, not just among parties, but with other stakeholders as well. This is critical in ensuring that while we do save the multilateral process, when it comes to decision making among parties, we want to be able to keep or to protect the faith of constituents in the process itself. So it brings to mind the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, where very few people were happy with the outcome, but we do know that an outcome was necessary in order to save the multilateral process. It's just that sometimes it's a difficult balance, I suppose, between saving the multilateral process and keeping the faith of the constituents in the process. So there have been talks, suggestions of reforming the COP process from a lot of stakeholders, enhancing transparency when it comes to documentation and tracking of commitments, stricter rules as well to limit fossil fuel industry influence, maybe reforming the finance mechanisms, increasing the capital of multilateral development banks, and introducing innovative financing mechanisms to the process, ensuring inclusivity, so greater representation of indigenous communities and vulnerable nations in the negotiations, and strengthening participatory mechanisms. Looking forward to Brazil, Brazil poses a new opportunity. It presents a critical opportunity to demonstrate greater inclusion and transparency in the climate negotiations, especially after what have been perceived as disappointments during COP29. I have heard that there is a People's Summit being planned that will go alongside the COP. So it's supposed to provide a platform for civil society voices to be heard alongside the official negotiations. I believe they're considering Rio de Janeiro as the venue for the People's Summit. And it's potentially to bring fresh perspectives to the climate discussions. And there's also, of course, the need for coalition building among civil society in particular, in order to ensure diverse representation. Because right now, if I don't know if people have already started looking at, bookings for Belém, Brazil, but they're quite cost prohibitive. So a lot of coalition building, I think, will be necessary in order to ensure that these perspectives, these views are brought to the fore during COP30. I think that's it for me. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't go over time.
Oh, just about right. Thank you very much, Dana. I think it was very important to that you also share a different perspective from outside the room. And that's the whole point of this dialogue, where we can have a sort of a balanced view, a comprehensive view, and collectively try to find a way forward. Again, I can't stress enough how important it is to work together collaboratively, all actors, all state actors, all stakeholders to chart the common path. And I wanted to just, if I may, from there very quickly move to Petra, just on the last point of reform and the future of the COP process. And I did ask if you could address this question, perhaps in a minute or two, given time constraints. There was a Club of Rome open letter calling for reform. What do you think about that, those suggestions, and what Nina has mentioned?
Yeah, so I almost feel, thank you very much for the question, Danielle. I almost feel like Diane would be extremely well placed to also come in. What is realistic here? I mean, if I had a wish free, I think what we would need to see is that expertise that is absolutely there at COP plays a more distinct role during the negotiations. In terms of how that can be organized, I read the letter actually of the Club of Rome through the lens of how can COPs be more of a platform where science is taken forward in terms of supporting countries in using science for their national policy making, but then also how is science taken forward at the international level in these decision makings. And we've heard about the Article 6 rules. There are, of course, the outcome of negotiations. There are compromises. They are not ideal in terms of any of the underlying purposes that they will serve. So they will depend, or much will depend from the application and implementation at the national level. And for all of that, we need science. So I think we also need science understood as not just climate science and natural science, but there's social sciences, there's economic expertise, there's legal science. So I think all of these aspects should play a role. And somehow we need countries to speak up to not just coming together to building coalitions of the ambition, coalition for the melting ice, but also coalition for this dialogue with academia and actively seeking this dialogue, because it needs to come from both sides. Otherwise, academics will have this issue with doors being closed. So starting with a few countries and working with them, I think that would be a great way forward.
Thank you, Petra. Perfect. It's a great, very practical and actionable suggestions on that. Diane, can I turn to you now? I mean, you have a choice. You can either answer the question on reform, future, or come back to the question of PIKE that you wanted to elaborate on a little bit more. And my question in particular is, what are your expectations of the priorities and focus of PIKE in the short to medium term?
Danielle, I will try to be quick and cover both. In terms of reform of COP, I think the perspectives I've been hearing across the panel is very interesting, and also I think very, very important. I mean, no multilateral process should just chug on in the same manner that it should. I think there is room for improvement. I mean, I'm speaking from a negotiator where I wouldn't mind also to be part of the inclusive process. You would have seen in COP29, Singapore, along with the Alliance of Small Island Developing States, AOSIS, we walked out of the room. We weren't seeing a figure. COP president wasn't being very consultative, and we decided to walk out because we had to make a stand. So I think in terms of reform, yes, I definitely think there is room for improvement. But I also will just remind colleagues that this is a UNFCCC process that has not agreed on its rules of procedure. So our draft rules of procedure gets adopted in draft form with the exception for the rule for voting, which is why we're in consensus. So I think there's space for improvement, but I also will just caution that, this process also has a habit of just wanting to go back to its old habits. Very quickly on Pike, it's going to be a really important year for us. We're having our first meeting in April where we have a lot of work ahead for us. We're only not talking about countries' NDCs that was to be submitted by 10th of February. We have the biannual transparency reports. This is the first time that countries are to submit their biannual transparency reports. It was supposed to come in at the end of December, and that's really where the transparency portion of Paris Agreement obligations kicks in, and we see what people are actually doing behind the scenes of their NDC, and that's actually a really critical piece of the implementation puzzle. And finally, of course, we've seen one round of it, and we're going to see the next round, which is the Article 9.5 financial communications by developed countries. And also that's very, very critical to be able to lend some transparency to the climate finance that's coming on. So it's a big task. We're not really relishing the task ahead because the submissions haven't been quite what we hoped for, but I think we're up for the challenge, and we'll hope for more progress as the year goes by, and we'll report at COP30.
That's great, Diane, for lifting the veil on what Pike is going to be looking at in this year. A lot of questions given, of course, the current status of the NDC submission. Sheila, may I turn to you now? You've spoken a little bit earlier about the impact of the current landscape on investors and still some optimism on that. So let me turn the question around a little bit. And there's also a question posed by one of the participants earlier. How can we encourage, or rather from your perspective, what kind of policy signals, what kind of legislative signals would you like governments to sort of indicate and give to continue to sort of strengthen investors' confidence and continue to make commitments in this regard?
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. So I think as an investor, one of the things we always look for is policy certainty, right? That gives you a little bit of confidence to invest. And often when it comes to things like policy certainty, we look very often to national policies and state policies. And so I think the linkage with COP is that a lot of what is agreed in COP, or whether it's agreed or not, needs to be translated into policy at a national level. So I think Petra showed some of the examples of things that have been agreed, right? There is a renewables target, there is a coal phase out target. All of that needs to be translated into a national policy. If not, it's quite hard for us to make an investment in a specific location, because when you are thinking about investment, you are not thinking in such general terms anymore, but we are actually thinking specifics. One good example is an investment that we are, or collaboration, not yet a full investment, that we are trying to make in the Philippines to accelerate the retirement of one of the coal plants there, right? So this is a plant in South Luzon. I think when we look at the policies there are several things that give us comfort. We know that the Philippines is thinking about doing a carbon market framework. So then that tells us that actually there is some potential for carbon markets or carbon credits to be used as a financial mechanism to enable the early retirement. We know, for example, that the Philippines has a renewable energy mandate. So they have a target for renewable energy. We know that the market is liberalized, and there are signals that tell us that, yes, we maybe can get this project going. So this is going to be a first of a kind thing. There are no carbon credit projects in the world that have, been able to accelerate the retirement of a coal plant. But I think a combination of some of these signals then tell us that we are able to do this. I think I could give you a few more examples, right? Like I talked about how there was agreement on Article 6 rules, but actually that in itself is not enough to get activity going, right? see very little Article 6 trades right now. And that's because it's still taking some time for governments to come to bilateral agreements. So Singapore, we've signed 3 bilateral agreements, one with Ghana, with um, Papua New Guinea, and with Bhutan last week. When we make an investment, like we have made an investment in an agroforestry project in Ghana, um, there needs to be understanding that there is this broader government framework between the 2 countries that will enable the trade of carbon credits before we can do it. Else, if we do it, but there is no agreement between Ghana and Singapore, we would just be making an agreement and hoping that Article 6 will somehow trickle down. So I think in short, the policies that we're looking at would really be at the government, the national and the state level.
Okay, great. Silang, thanks very much for that. I think policy certainty, and of course to the policy decision makers who are listening in right now, that's a very important clarion call as to what will be needed to move this process, at least to get in private investment money into the picture. And then can I turn to you, given all that you have heard, and the issue of climate finance is a very important one. And Nauru recently announced a very interesting new citizenship by investment scheme, raising finance for climate action. So in exchange for, I believe it's 100,000 or 150 US thousand, you get Nauru citizenship, and that money is supposed to go towards climate finance. So what suggestion and advance for you do you have for countries in the global south who are trying to forge innovative and effective pathways for climate finance? I mean, the reality, as Sila mentioned, is that globally countries are also in a sort of a fiscal squeeze. How can they help themselves? Thank you.
So yeah, the Nauru Golden Passport program has been particularly interesting. I think it's $105,000 to get citizenship and access to 89 destinations visa-free. So yeah, I think that's a particularly innovative way of going forward. It's definitely going to be challenging for the global south to come up with these kinds of programs. There have been, for example, blended finance has always been mentioned internationally as a way to maybe tap into greater funding involving the private sector. There are the public-private partnerships, there's scaling up private sector investment, investment in green infrastructure projects, for example, utilizing local financing avenues, the potential carbon markets that can be tapped, and imposing carbon tax, for example. Green bonds have been discussed a lot. They're also starting to discuss blue bonds, interestingly, with I believe the SDG on oceans being one of the least funded SDGs globally. So there's also, of course, South-South cooperation. Given the uncertain times with U.S. aid, for example, all of the challenges that has been faced by a lot of organizations because of the drying up of U.S. aid funding. South-South cooperation can, I believe, help address the gaps, maybe bridge some of the finance gaps, bolster climate change resilience. It as a model, South-South cooperation can emphasize peer-to-peer learning, for example, and resource sharing among developing nations. So that's another option that can be explored. I did hear that some analysts view the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement as an opportunity to maybe reconfigure the climate finance ecosystem, not only just by leveraging public and private funds, but also philanthropic capital. So I think it would be particularly interesting to see how creative the global south can get when it comes to accessing funds and bridging these gaps in funding that is being caused by the US's not only leaving the Paris Agreement, but also withdrawing all of its commitments. So scaling back, not even scaling back, but basically revoking its international climate finance plan. So yeah, definitely challenging times ahead.
Thank you very much, Nina. I think it's a good reminder that in every challenge there is an opportunity. So let's see collectively what innovative ways we can proceed. And I think it's very important. Now, I know time's running out. We started about 5 minutes late. So if I may beg your indulgence, I just wanted to run through a couple of questions that have been posed in the chat. And as a final roundup, choose the questions that you want to reply to. One, of course, is where you see in a snapshot the future of global climate action. How can governments, corporate society best act and respond to the current changing environment? The second question for the audience is, how can we hold countries accountable to taking further actions to reduce fossil fuel dependence and to work towards a global goal of preventing a climate emergency? A third question is, how can the biannual transparency report, the BTR, be incorporated into the NDC and global stocktake cycle? And I will just throw in one question of my own, which is your analysis and assessment. What would you like to see in the ICJ's forthcoming advisory opinion on climate change that will influence states in sustaining strong global climate action as well? And one final question of the audience, how can we convince states of the importance of environmental law and addressing climate change? And actually, in a sense, this goes beyond climate, right? We've got the fairly not so successful plastics negotiations as well. So overall, what can we do? So take your pick, if I may, 1 minute each to wrap up the discussion. Petra, you look very excited. Shall we start with you?
I was hoping I could defer to some of the other speakers. Where are the questions? Can we just have a? Can you point me to the? Is it in the chat? Danielle, I can't hear you. I think in the interest of brevity,
Oh, sorry. There were 2 in the Q&A, so feel free to choose any question, or as well as the questions that I had posed earlier in my notes to panelists. So maybe while you think about that, who's ready to begin?
I'm happy to start.
Celia, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, because as the non-lawyer here, I will stay far away from the ICJ question. I'll answer the question about, I think, how I think about future global climate action. Right? So I think climate action is still going to continue, as I talked about. The science cannot be denied. But it will look different. I think, as you mentioned, Daniel, it will be more discerning and mature, more economically driven and silent and slower. So I think when it comes to what I mean by more discerning and mature, we see that, as I mentioned, economic imperatives driving a lot of the lens behind climate action. Even if we're not talking about countries, companies will be more aware about what they can and cannot say, and what they will need to do to comply, what they need to do to comply with policy. I think we could then also see a bit more investment into an action on adaptation, because that's one of the areas where you can, in a sense, concentrate a little bit more of the benefits within your boundaries, right? Whether that's within your country or whether that's within your value chain for a company. I think we are seeing a anti-ESG wave. And so what we used to see in climate was a lot of people talking about their climate action. And to some extent, maybe there was a bit of risk of a greenwashing. Right now, with a bit more of an anti-ESG wave, I think the narrative will change. It will not be about climate. The economic pressures will force governments and companies to talk more about how this is delivering immediate benefit, right? And climate is going to be, in a sense, a co-benefit or a secondary benefit. That may not necessarily be a bad thing, actually, if action is still being taken. Then I think it will be slower. It's quite clear why it will be slower, because I think with less of that pressure, there's going to be less peer pressure both for companies, but also very importantly for countries when they set their NDCs and they look to what other countries are doing. And there's less peer pressure, there'll be less of an incentive to do more. Yeah.
Thank you very
Okay,
much
I've
for
answered
those
the easier
insights.
question. Yeah.
Thank you very much for insights. Thank you. Easy? Not at all. I think it's a very difficult question. Very careful what we need to say nowadays for corporates. Diane, would you like to give it a go?
I will address the accountability issue because I don't want to talk about the ICJ judgment. I'll leave it to Professor Petra to talk about that. I think on accountability, I think obviously PIKE is going to have a role to play. We do take our role fairly seriously, quite very seriously, in fact. It is, again, non-punitive and facilitative in nature, but we are going to obviously be the pressure point for countries to first get their NDCs submitted, BTR submitted, Article 9.5. And I think there was a specific question on the BTR, and just to also flag that it's actually quite a technical process, and your BTRs, countries' BTRs will be subjected to review, and that could be flagged for discrepancies. So the BTR process itself actually has a couple of layers to it, and that will actually help, I think, to really make sure that there is like real transparency in how people are going about their national inventory of gases and that sort of thing. So yes, I think that's the role that PIKE will play, accountability. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Diane. The buzzword being accountability here. Nina, and I'll leave the the ICJ questions for Petra.
I think
Yes,
it would
Nina.
be best for Dr. Petra to respond to the ICJ question. And maybe like this could be a segue to that. I was actually just struck by how the question on accountability, so how we can hold countries accountable to taking further actions to reduce fossil fuel dependence, would actually tie in with the ICJ advisory opinion. So one of the goals of the advisory opinion, at least of those who requested for it, is for the ICJ to explain the extent to which states are legally required to prevent environmental harm and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that's in particular, as well as protect the rights, of course, of populations that are affected by climate change. So I think that in particular is what I'm looking forward to seeing from the advisory opinion, for the ICJ advisory opinion, and it's how we can link accountability with the findings of the ICJ. Bearing in mind, of course, that the ICJ opinion is not strictly legally binding, but they do carry moral and legal weight. So I will turn it over now to Professor Petra.
Petra, so sorry to put you on the spot, but if you could address this and then we will wrap up after this. Thank you.
Not at all. Thank you very much. Indeed, I'm quite grateful because I still can't read the Q&A, maybe because I'm not co-host or so. So I'm glad I only have to remember the ICJ question now, which is deep enough. So thank you. And I think there may be a few key points. Hopefully, the ICJ will reduce complexity. We all know this is a societal issue. We know how many different aspects are involved in climate change, but it is also an environmental issue. So I think there are standards which states have agreed, and these standards have worked in the past to place accountability on governments, and this should be not forgotten in the climate change context. So there are clear ways to construe these legal obligations. That's maybe the first point. Hopefully we will see that there is clarity on legal obligations. But then also they are not only coming from the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, they're coming from other agreements as well. So in other words, we've already seen this development also from the ITLOS advisory opinion, that it is not sufficient to submit your NDC and to thereby discharge your legal obligations. There are other agreements from which these legal obligations will flow. And so the third point is then perhaps in the light of these existing legal obligations to also strengthen the due diligence and good faith obligations. I know this is sometimes regarded as being soft and not clear enough, but there's a lot of case law on the good faith obligation as well. And once a country has entered into a certain agreement and then also agreed to certain subsequent agreements in form of COP decisions, I think there is some certainty in terms of the legal content. So hopefully we will see some certainty and clarity from that. And yes, it's not going to be legally binding, of course, but it is a very authoritative instrument at the international level, an advisory opinion. So it will be very interesting.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Petra, for that. And my thanks to every one of you, Diane, Nina, and Liang, for a very informative and very insightful discussions. I'm glad we were able to flag different viewpoints to chew on. I'm not going to summarize this. We already overshot the time. But I thank you for your indulgence and for the really rich discussions we've had. This discussion is recorded. It will be available online, and we will also be producing a sort of a webinar report summarizing the key points from this discussion. So thank you very much, everyone, online and also present in the room, for your interest and participation. Thank you. Good day, good night to everyone.